We actually exist in a microbial bubble. You're carrying this bubble with you. So if you go into a hotel room, you get to experience briefly the bubble that was being carried by the prior occupant of that hotel room. And you're carrying this along. And if you have family members, a larger family, if you have pets, the pets, particularly dogs, will help transfer microbes. They're really good. You just watch their behavior. They're really good at going from individual to individual, and other aspects of their behavior enable microbes to be transferred. And in fact, I argue in some of my talks that if you look at the way dogs greet each other, you'll really see they're checking out the microbiome probably first and foremost, rather than facial recognition. Because it turned out that if you're looking at environmental chemicals and risk for human health, and particularly relative, in this case, to infections, turned out you really couldn't say too much unless you understood what the microbes were doing with the chemicals first, because they see them first.
Hey folks, welcome back to High Intensity Health Radio. It's Mike Mutzel here. Thank you so much for tuning back in today. I'm super excited to have Dr. Rodney Dietert with us. He's a professor of immunotoxicology at Cornell University and the author of this amazing book right here that hopefully you can see, The Human Superorganism, How the Microbiome is Revolutionizing the Pursuit of a Healthy Life, which we're going to dive into the details of this book and Dr. Rod's life's work. So, Dr. Dietert, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure to join you, Mike.
Fantastic. So let's start off a little bit with the landscape. And I love how you introduced this whole topic in the book about this new era of biology, how we're kind of moving beyond, this superiority complex that humans have and scientists have kind of given to humans that the only genome that matters is a human genome. And we know that's so far from true. So let's kind of give an overview of the landscape, if you would.
Well, exactly. I mean, in many ways, we're more awesome than we ever thought we were, but we're also more humble because we share so many organisms with a large part of the earth, actually. They live within us, but they also live in many extreme locations around the globe. And so we're made up of thousands of different species, and a lot of them microbial. And in fact, the majority of our genes come from these microbes. And of course, they do a lot of metabolism as well. So it's not shocking if the majority of the genes are microbial, and if they're producing enzymes that metabolize, that they're going to have a major impact on us. So for this reason, it's a shepherding or stewardship opportunity that we have, in going through life to boost what we used to think of as humans, along with the other thousands of species that are co-partners with us, and have a really healthy, enjoyable, productive, satisfying life as well. And so the book really invites readers to view humans differently, to view our role on Earth in the environment and interacting with others differently, and also the pursuit of wellness or health differently, because it really does give us an opportunity to approach everything from diet to protection against environmental chemicals and toxicants, to preventative medicine, and also to medical treatments in a very different way, a way that takes into account all of those species. And it makes essentially reviews the literature, but in a what I think is a readable way, and presents opportunities for people to use self-help and also to have a dialogue with their health professionals that's quite different than we've had in the past.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, do you think we've hit that tipping point in science that where we understand that we're including the microbiome in research? I know you've been a huge part of kind of this movement in the immunotoxicology world and encouraging people to look at their pharmacodynamic models and say, okay, we've been looking at toxicology through the lens of the human genome and ignoring the microbiome. So have we hit that tipping point when you go to scientific conferences and networks, within your community? Are people starting to include the microbiome in their studies, or are we still kind of, trending that way but not there yet? Give us an overview of that.
Well, there are different layers, so it depends on the audience that you're interacting with. With the science conferences that I'm going to, you don't have to do too much persuasion because the literature is exploding with microbiome research, and most people understand they want that programming, they want that information, they want the latest on it represented in their conferences. In fact, one conference I attended on infectious diseases a couple of years back literally degenerated into a microbiome conference because it turned out that if you're looking at environmental chemicals and risk for human health, and particularly relative, in this case, to infections, turned out you really couldn't say too much unless you understood what the microbes were doing with the chemicals first, because they see them first.
I know that's been a huge part of your life's work is looking at environmental toxicants and so forth. So we know that environmental chemicals are bad for our health and the endocrine disrupting aspect and how they affect the immune system. But do is this exposure to BPAs and phthalates, and you talk about this, I think, in the last chapter of your book, are these compounds really perturbing the microbiome as well?
Yes, and not just environmental chemicals, but drugs. I mean, part of the message I had for my toxicology colleagues is there's good news, bad news. There's make work for toxicologists, but we get to do toxicology over in a sense because most of the models have been for the mammalian human, again, for the mammalian part of us, and have not really included the diversity of the microbiome into account in terms of vulnerable populations for exposures. And so we now get to do that. And I think that's going to be extremely important. So yes, environmental chemicals as toxicants, but also even drugs like NSAIDs, even some of the statins, the heart drugs. All of these things have to be really reevaluated and individual risk assessed based on the microbiome.
Hmm. And I think that's pretty challenging because there's not one enterotype, right? There's multiple enterotypes. So how do you kind of stratify for that? Like how we're learning about metformin and how metformin changes. I'm sure you've seen the research on how it changes gut ecology and affects gut hormones and so forth. So how, I mean, just as a kind of a, this is a tangential questions, I guess, but how are toxicologists looking at this with multiple enterotypes and interactions there with the microbiome? How do you even, where do you start?
Well, there's a lot to learn. First of all, in no way do I present a reality that we know everything we need to know. No way. But we know enough to begin to do things. So you're exactly right. There are different enterotypes. There's some debate about it, but they seem to exist and they seem to be linked to our millennia of our ancestry. So those things that our ancestors were exposed to, the food, the diets they ate, helped shape over thousands of years these different enterotypes. And the reality is, it's easier if you want to shift your microbiome to a healthier state to probably try to move it within the enterotype than between enterotypes, and that just makes sense. It's a smaller change in a sense. But nevertheless, even within every one of these enterotypes, we can distinguish what looks like a healthier microbiome versus those that are unhealthy. And in most cases, this pertains to what I call non-communicable diseases. We used to call them chronic diseases. And that's what's killing the majority of people worldwide now. So it becomes important to understand that if you could have a healthier total human, a healthier microbiome from birth, beginning with birth, that you've got a better opportunity to prevent some of these diseases that we carry for decades and eventually are the most probable cause of killing us.
And you talk about a lot of the microbial transfers through moms and mothers.
Yes.
And is that not only through the vaginal flora and breast milk, but also through cuddling and touching and kissing? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So the birth event itself is not the only donation window, but it's the most critical donation window. And that is when the baby has the majority of the seeding of the microbes. So the in utero, it's not completely sterile. There are placenta microbes and some evidence the baby is at least exposed to the microbes, and that can affect the immune system. But the large installation of the rest of the baby, the microbial part, is at birth. And so when vaginal delivery is possible, the baby receives this massive bolus through the birth canal, and skin-skin contact is really important as well. So yes, microbes are transferred in skin-skin contact, and that's extremely important. But the problem is if the baby misses the birth canal exposure event. If that seeding never happens, then the baby eventually will acquire microbes, but they're going to be from a hospital environment, basically, from attendants from other places. And we've already been able to see in recent studies that this is different. These microbes that then are installed in the baby that begin to mature are different from those that come about through vaginal delivery transfer. And that difference counts. It particularly counts for the immune system. It counts for the brain and the neurological system. And you can show that there is simply a different maturation of our physiology under those circumstances. And that is also translating to a higher risk of a number of different diseases and conditions, obesity, type 1 diabetes, and asthma, for example. So whenever possible, having a plan for that kind of seeding or the equivalent of it. Vaginal birth's not always possible, but for the equivalent of that seeding, and there are some alternatives now that exist, is really important so that the baby has those installed. I say the baby self-completes
Hmm.
or becomes a completed individual because it has the majority now of the genes that it needs. It has the microbial genes. And so that's really important. Skin is a transfer opportunity, and breastfeeding also transfers microbes in addition to something else really, really important. For a long time, nutritionists, scientists questioned why does breast milk have so much of breast milk have components that mammalian cells can't digest, that our human mammalian cells can't use because nature really doesn't do that kind of thing. It doesn't waste a lot of material, and that would be incredibly wasteful. And it turns out now we know that's not wasted at all. It's never intended for our own mammalian cells. That is the food for the microbes. It's the food that helps them progress and mature as the baby moves from birth to 1 year of age, for example. So that is absolutely critical. So breastfeeding, you get both microbes, you get some immune boosting or enhancing components that are important that also help protect the baby, and then you have the food for the microbes, the prebiotics we call them, and that's what's transferred with breastfeeding. And at the moment, formula does not account for those three components: the immune transfer, the prebiotics, and the transfer of microbes directly.
Yeah, I've looked at infant formula recently. I have a 4-year-old, but a friend of mine is wanting to come up with his own infant formula because what's available out there right now is really poor in terms of the prebiotic and also the source of the protein. A lot of it is soy protein, and it says non-GMO, and then there's a lot of oxidized oils and processed oils. So it's really not
Oh,
the
yeah.
healthiest stuff in the world. But you were talking about the galacto-oligosaccharides and so forth, the prebiotics in the
Yes.
breast milk and so
Yes.
forth. So those are really powerful for kind of setting the stage for the ecosystem to really develop. Is
They're
that right?
incredibly powerful because, I mean, a lot of people will try to shift their microbiome, or we call it rebiosis, and there are a lot of ways to do that, and it's become a very useful strategy. And as you know, I present in the book that it's actually nothing new. It's something that was happening in agriculture for 30, 40 years and was extremely successful as a proof of concept. So it's not shocking that you can shift your microbiome, but it's really hard to shift if you don't actually feed the microbes that you want to install or you want to encourage to grow or and increase in numbers. So those prebiotics are really important because they are the direct energy source for particular species of bacteria and other components of the microbiome.
Let's go back a little bit to the ecology, and you talk about this in the book, like rainforests and even your garden and stuff like that. How
Mhm.
certain microbes in the wrong location can be bad. And so, going back to the hospital setting where you take Clostridia or staph that's normally inhabits the skin, then that becomes colonized in the GI tract of the infant. So, what goes wrong there? Are we turning on the immune system, making it more hypervigilant? Can you talk about that immune education? Why that's such an important kind of stamping, if you will, on the infant for later life?
Yeah, so when I was a student, and that's decades, a long time ago, I was basically taught, well, the immune system in humans is fully mature at birth and everything's there and you're good to go. And it turns out, yeah, not really. You're good to go if you don't mind having a wealth of chronic diseases across the lifetime. Because basically, the immune system at birth, first of all, it's not really complete now that we understand their specialized populations we didn't used to be able to detect, the regulatory T cells, for example. So, what happens is the microbes in the immune system grow up together. That's why the baby, as early as possible, needs the complete seeding with the microbiome. And they grow up together and they change and mature over the first couple of years of life in particular. And that's a critical window in which the immune system has to learn how to operate with the environment that we live in. And so it's going to see pollen, it's going to see environmental pollutants, urban air pollutants, for example. It's going to see potentially harmful infectious agents. And it's got to know how to distinguish among those. So it's got to be primed and ready to go, but it shouldn't be essentially wild and shooting at anything. And what will happen is if the microbes are not installed and maturing along with the immune system effectively never matures correctly, and it will eventually misfire. It will cause a self-destruction. It can show up as allergic diseases. It can show up as autoimmune and inflammatory conditions. And that it's just a matter of sort of time and triggers, and it is a probability. Doesn't mean every individual has that experience, but more and more of us are having those experiences.
With allergies and so forth. So that's why the seeding is really, really important. So another event that you talk about in the early life is family size. And you talk about in China, there's an issue, and also in India, where they're selecting different genders, right? And so forth. So let's talk about family size. How does that affect microbiome diversity? Because I've read some research where smaller family size, not having household pets and so forth, that all affects the immune system and also predisposition to lower bacterial diversity.
Right. So we actually exist in a microbial bubble. And in fact, the whole Earth, if you look at the upper atmosphere, it's a microbial bubble. So you could argue that basically we're seeing our reality through microbes, pretty much, whether it's out of our body, looking at the surroundings, or beyond the Earth. We're looking through microbes in each case. So when you're carrying this bubble with you. So if you go into a hotel room, you get to experience briefly the bubble that was being carried by the prior occupant of that hotel room, and you're carrying this along. And if you have family members, a larger family, if you have pets, the pets, particularly dogs, will help transfer microbes. They're really good. You just watch their behavior. They're really good at going from individual to individual, and other aspects of their behavior enable microbes to be transferred. And in fact, I argue in some of my talks that if you look at the way dogs greet each other, you'll really see they're checking out the microbiome probably first and foremost, rather than facial recognition. I mean, that's the way they operate and behave, and that's for a reason. I think they're actually saying, who are you microbially, and how healthy are you, in the end. So having a pet and having a larger family just means you will share microbes among you, and there may be more to share. You'll have different environmental experiences as well. Now, that can be good, that can be not so good. It depends on what your ancestors did, what your life experience is in terms of what you're sharing around. And so I basically argue in the book that there's a short-term and a long-term strategy for having a healthier microbiome, or one that supports better health. And because clearly, if a baby is given or seeded with a microbiome that is from a mother who has a number of different chronic diseases, and nothing has actually been done to restore the microbiome in that mother, then the baby is going to receive a microbiome that reflects those chronic diseases. And so I've actually told OBGYNs that they have a wonderful new opportunity, and that is to correct the microbiome in pregnant women, or rebalance it, or have it such that it benefits the mother in her own health, and also helps for the seeding of the healthiest possible microbiome to her baby.
That's beautiful. So what are those recommendations to the OBGYNs?
Well, I think if, for example, you have a mother carrying diabetes, or asthma, or another, again, inflammatory bowel, you can go down the list of all the numerous non-communicable diseases that are associated with very often skewed microbiomes, limited diversity of the microbiome, then that is an opportunity to look at rebiosis in adult men and women, and particularly with pregnancy, so that can be a complementary therapeutic approach for adjusting the microbiome and bringing better health to the mother, or to be mother, and at the same time you're really preparing a healthier spectrum of the microbiome for the baby. And so that's really the opportunity, is to look more holistically at the mother that is being seen by OBGYNs, and look at that relative to the two-generation strategy, the mother at present and her health, and the baby's future health.
That's fantastic. And if we could dive into the details of rebiosis, are we talking about FMT, or like in the book how you end it with kombucha and sauerkraut and kimchi, fermented foods?
So there's no single strategy. I mean, there are a wealth of different opportunities, and it can start with, you mentioned fermented foods, and one of the things that I've recognized, I mean, at my age, and I talk to a lot of friends, and I can go back a couple of generations and see in my ancestry a number of fermented foods that were very prominent in the diet that became really rare with my parents, and then I really didn't get to experience until now, when I've realized the benefit of that. And that's happened to a lot of people, a lot of their ancestral experience. It turns out that part of that, is, as I present in the book, has to do with our food technology and the availability of food, and that it's usually non-local now, and that often it's more processed, for example, and that we kind of lost the connection to the older foods that actually were doing something beneficial we didn't realize until recently. So kombucha, kimchi, all of sauerkraut, all of these possible fermented foods were in many different cultures, many different parts of the world, and they were actually helping with microbiome maintenance in a useful way. So I encourage people to explore those and see what might work for them as one way to get a source of probiotics. In addition to that, there are a number of supplements that are available. It's a bit of the wild, wild west because it depends upon the strain of the bacteria you're getting. And often mixes of different species of bacteria are more useful than a single bacterium. In addition, however, the strain and the genes that are being carried are all important as well. So not all strains of Lactobacillus acidophilus are the same. They're not carrying the same genes. They won't necessarily give you the same metabolic effect, and so it becomes important to understand that, at least in testing out and selection of potential supplements. But I think we're going to see more of this. We're going to see it not just for the gut, but for the skin and for oral nasal passages, other approaches where these kind of complementary supplemental therapies are going to be useful. So probiotic supplementation for multiple sites is one of the strategies. Another that has been used is the fecal microbiota transplantation, FMT. And that, again, has been very successful for treating recurrent infections of some kinds. It has some promise with inflammatory bowel, although there's still more research to be done there. But I think, again, as that is refined, you're only as good as the donor that you use for FMT. That's going to be a part of the therapy that's available. It used to be a rather laborious procedure. Now you can take capsules, so it's far less difficult. But donor selection is going to be really important, and understanding what you want as a donor preparation, ideally.
Yes.
And that may have some individualization too, as we move to personalized medicine, precision medicine, it's also called. Then understanding what you want to donate, what needs to be donated, is going to be really important. So I think there'll be no one universal FMT donor. I'd wish that for my retirement plan, but no. There's going to be many options, and it'll be tailoring the donor source to the patient that will be the most useful.
Interesting. So you would find someone, say, for example, if you had type 2 diabetes that had really good metabolic health sort of thing, or would you look at their enterotype and find different levels of specific genre or species level bacteria that you would like talk about, like the specificity there? Why is that important?
Right. So you've actually identified the two categories. So you'd want to look certainly at the genera, the species, the families even that are missing in type 2 diabetes, and be sure that those are part of the donation. But you also may want to be working more in enterotype, again, because of this idea that it may be easier to move that short distance than to try and be halfway around the world from an ancestral experience that you've never had at all. That may be tougher in terms of getting your system to really accept that and have those installed fully. So within enterotype, but replacing or putting in what you're missing in diversity is really important.
Awesome. So let's go back a little bit. You said a lot of important things about diet and probiotics that I want to take a deep dive in, because I think our listeners will be interested. Going back to the probiotics, you mentioned that strain specificity is so important, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. This is a big message that I try to promote in my videos. Is a lot of folks go to the GNC or Walmart or wherever and get a probiotic because it says Lactobacillus acidophilus. They assume that that's good. Now we know there's different substrains within that given genre and species. So with that in mind, is it really the bacterial DNA that is so important? I mean, when people take probiotics, they assume that these bacteria are going to grow and proliferate and cause an ecological niche. But what I inferred from your last segment there on the probiotics is that it's really those genes that they're transferring. Can you give us an overview really about how probiotics are affecting our immunological and metabolic health?
So there are two different ways. First of all, you may be able to get some transitory benefit if you have a flow through type system. So a lot of people argue, oh, it's really tough to get these bacteria to stay and be prominent residents where they need to be. And in some cases, that's true. I mean, that's still being refined. There are different ways to deliver them, different formulations that people are experimenting with to have better success in having them take up residence. And some of that being the prebiotic foods as well. So that's important. But even a flow through system where you have them metabolizing, if only briefly, with their food and that going into your body can be useful as well. And so that can be just, even if you didn't have them prominently taking up residence, having that as part of your metabolic profile could be beneficial. But the hope is they'll take up residence where they belong and will, for a long time in the future, when you feed them, produce the metabolites they need. Now, those enzymes and the cell surface components that they're carrying, sort of what they're wearing on their surface, that are going to interact in the end with immune cells, or with the lining cells, the barrier cells, and immune cells, are really important. And those are the proteins and enzymes that the bacteria are making coming from the genes. So that's why the genes really are important. Just having the species alone is not going to necessarily produce the metabolite that your body needs to change your physiology. And that's going to come from a particular gene that is carried in many strains of a particular species. You just want to be sure you have the strain with the gene that is the one you're hoping to have. And there is a literature on that. I mean, you can go through and basically find strains that have been characterized and have those properties. And they're my personal favorites for within my own family for the probiotics that we use.
That's fantastic. Some of the strains and, well, the genre and species that you talk about in the book, Akkermansia mucinophilia, Fucobacterium prausnitzii. These are things that you can't, at present knowledge to my awareness, we can't get these in supplemental form, but a healthy diet rich in fiber can increase the proliferation and growth of these.
Right. But there are efforts to bring those in supplemental form. So that's not, believe me, by next month when the book comes out, they may be there. So those efforts are ongoing. But that's a case, what you just mentioned is really important because in some instances, it really is the imbalance or the lack of a single species of bacterium that can be absolutely critical for risk of a variety of different diseases. So I don't want people to have the impression that they have to transform half of their microbiome in their gut to get a health benefit. It may be as simple as restoring the presence of one species in some cases. And that certainly is the case, again, with some of the inflammation-driven diseases where it looks like it's not a massive target of change. It's really getting a handful of them changed. In addition, for drug metabolism, we now know, again, that the difference between a drug being effective in some cases, digoxin being an example, a drug being toxic and potentially killing a patient, or being ineffective can be based on the presence of one particular bacterial species, or as little as that. So I think in the future, physicians are really simply not going to prescribe drugs without knowing a microbiome profile, because to do so could either lead to an ineffective treatment or could actually be dangerous for the patient, or present a risk that had not been included in the calculation. And so I think we're going to actually be treating based on microbiome profile in the future.
Oh my goodness, that's really fascinating. But one thing that comes to mind that you were talking about in that last segment that I want to expand upon is kind of this notion of a keystone species. One of your colleagues we interviewed, Lipping Zhao, talked about that, and he talked about Fucobacterium prausnitzii being this keystone species that kind of affects the entire ecological niche. Was that what you were referring to about how if you can just increase one species, it really helps the stabilization of the niche? Is that what you were saying?
Right. It's sort of like marigolds in your garden, as a pest preventative. I mean, I think that's not a bad analogy. So you have some species that sort of take care of the local environment, be it part of your gut or part of your skin. They are doing a lot that actually helps to condition the soil, so to speak, so that a lot of the opportunity for other species is influenced by their own presence, their activity, their metabolism. And so a lot of the keystone species are doing exactly that. They're determining the condition of that part of your body and making that optimal for some very desirable species to be present. And so changing that just a little bit can have this domino effect that's very powerful.
That's awesome. Let's finish up with diet and then we'll go into some more things. But fiber, this is
Yes.
a really polarizing topic because the whole SIBO community is against fiber, against fermented foods and things that can increase the growth of bacteria because it will exacerbate SIBO-like symptoms. A lot of the folks that study the microbiome, like yourself, Rodney, are fans of high fiber diets because it improves diversity. So give us your perspective on high fiber versus no fiber, the SIBO argument. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think that there's not necessarily a one size fit all. I'm very much pro fiber in general. If you had a medical condition, it's much like if you're allergic to peanuts. I mean, peanut products are recommended by the Mayo Clinic. I think I mentioned that in the book as something you could carry if you're in a diabetic crisis. On the other hand, if you were allergic, that wouldn't be your choice. And so, in this case, I think where people can tolerate fiber, that's a wonderful option, or an increase in fiber. On the other hand, you may need a different way in particular patients where that is going to present its own risk to get at prebiotic foods, to get at a source of foods in a different way that does not exacerbate that particular condition. And I think those opportunities exist. So it's a matter of being a little bit clever about it and understanding what the actual goal is in nurturing the microbes and how you can get there. And for many people, it's through fiber. And for those where it's not, there are going to be other alternatives where you can still support the microbes, but not exacerbate a medical condition.
Let's take a deep dive into a real prevalent medical condition, heart disease. You talk about it in the book as a common non-communicable disease. There's a whole research on TMAO and carnitine and meat and so forth. Give us a little bit of overview about how bacteria and our diet influence the risk of heart disease.
Well, one of the one of the big things I mentioned in the book is that non-communicable diseases, first of all, they're the epidemic of them. Is viewed in many cases as these individual diseases because physicians treat them by diagnosis, by disease, by medical coding. Researchers work on them usually one disease at a time. They'll have a grant to work on asthma or a grant to work on type 1 diabetes. And there are all kinds of ways that we partition them out. But they're actually, if you look at the underlying perturbances and the underlying features of non-communicable diseases, they're connected by misregulated inflammation. In fact, you have to have inappropriate inflammation for these things to continue on and persist. And so it's not that simply correcting inflammation is a magic bullet, because if you've damaged the lung through decades of COPD or asthma or something like that, you're not going to put back functionality by just reducing inflammation. But nevertheless, this ongoing inappropriate inflammation, misdirected inappropriate inflammation, is a feature of so many different non-communicable diseases. And it is really reflected in, again, the mistraining of the immune system and what happens if an immature, untrained immune system then encounters microbes later in life. It's bad news. Or encounters pollen, or encounters urban air pollution. It's very bad news. And that's really what we're seeing. And heart disease has many different components that contribute to it, including air pollution. But most of these things, depression as well, obesity, the metabolic syndrome spectrum, these are pro-inflammatory conditions. And so, again, one of the things that we can do very simply is ensure that as infants are maturing, that they're not going to be headed toward that kind of physiological outcome. And that starts by going back to the microbiome, the barriers in the skin, in the gut, and the underlying immune cells, and be sure that those signals are appropriate in education so that you don't have inappropriate inflammation. It's a very simple way to begin to address problems, whether they occur in the brain with neurobehavioral alterations, whether you have atherosclerosis, again, cardiac or heart disease, obesity, or asthma. You can begin to at least eliminate the possibility you're going to have that indiscriminate, misregulated inflammation. So I think that that's one of the keys in looking at, diet is extremely important, but I've argued it's diet in combination with the microbiome that you need to look at. You need to look at the two together and let them work with each other most effectively. And so I think that that's an opportunity. The earlier in life, the better.
Hmm. Oh, beautifully said. So you described this common soil hypothesis that has been emerging for a long time. This notion that all diseases share this, as you described just eloquently there, Rodney, this common, dysfunction. You talked about the immune system. And so a big trigger of the immune system, as you mentioned, is barrier permeability. And you talk about this in the book, and leaky gut and so forth. And so
Yes.
a lot of the research has focused on endotoxin containing bacteria and leaky gut and activation of this powerful immune signaling molecule called toll-like receptor 4. Is that a main mechanism that you see in terms, I mean, there's many switches, but is that a big switch that you've like folks to understand and know about?
It is a switch. There are actually many, many different switches, and so I wouldn't want to give the impression that that is a major switch. It is not the only way to get to inappropriate inflammation and inappropriate activation of the immune system. So there's several different cell types in there, very specialized cell types. There's a lot going on in the first year of a baby's life, and there's a lot of ways that you can get out of balance and wind up with inflammation that's inappropriate. But getting, again, the wrong bacterial signals through those barriers is a big part of it. So actually, my most recent paper deals with an approach that looks at the microbiome barriers, whether they're in skin, in gut, or blood-brain, for example, or the airways, and then the underlying immune system as a unit together. Because I think looking at the health of all of those in signaling and metabolism is really important. So loss of barrier function in the gut is a real problem. That's a quick way to get to a lot of these diseases that I've mentioned. And that again comes about when you don't have those keystone species of bacteria in place, when the diet's not appropriate to support the correct mix of bacteria, and when the immune cells are not getting the signals they need early on. And as a result, it'll lead to imbalances.
Let's finish off a little bit on the T regulatory cells. You mentioned these guys kind of dampen the inflammatory system. Any bacteria that we should know about? Any dietary strategies? I know there's some research on vitamin D. There's some stuff on curcumin that we should know about when it comes to T reg cells.
Well, there are several populations. So Tregs are important. They're sort of counterbalance what are called Th17 that produce. They're named that because they produce an interleukin called 17 as one of their major products. There's some other things called invariant natural killer T cells. Those are really important as well. And the sizes of these, the relative sizes are important. And the sizes of those populations change a lot during particularly first year of a baby's life. And so controlling that mix is really what it's about in large part. And there are a number of different species that do that, both from their cell surface molecules, but also by what they secrete. So there are these things called short chain fatty acids, and I discuss those a lot in the book. Turns out they're really important, not just for immune health, but neurological health as well. In fact, a lot of different physiological systems. And these are really small molecules. I think people underappreciated what they can do, and we're now really learning that they can massively control neurobehavior. They can control immune regulation, and including Tregs. And so it's not a single bacterial species, but it's the mix of species that become really important in presenting metabolites to the underlying immune cells that are going to determine the mix of those populations and whether a baby is really armed well and balanced well for future health, or whether the self-destruction is likely to occur.
And that becomes really important later in life because we know this inflammaging, this increase in inflammation associated with aging. So if we could summarize some microbiome strategies for folks nearing retirement. We have a lot of folks in their 50s and 60s that listen to this podcast and stuff like that. Could you summarize maybe some of the things that are really important to improve bacterial diversity and kind of offset this inflammaging that occurs with age?
Yeah, so I mean, it's never too late. I mean, there is immune programming, there is developmental programming, or what we call developmental origins of adult disease that happens, but you can have benefit by rebalancing the microbiome at any age. And I tell a story in the book about my personal experience, really, of getting off of what was probably a total of about 100 rounds of antibiotics across my adult life, to where the last 2.5 years I've had none. And I did that through a combination of rebiosis and dietary changes and figuring out what was contributing to underlying inflammation that was so extensive that I hadn't really even been aware of it. So I'm researching inflammation, I'm writing about it. And until I had this event that I describe in the book, I wasn't even aware to the extent to which it was going on in my own body. And I had a rather profound event happen over in Europe and realized, wow, this is what's going on, and I have the tools to do something about it. And so, again, I'm in my 60s, and I was able to make that kind of change in concert working with my health professionals. But essentially, they've been, I think, as pleasantly surprised as I've been about the power of changing diet and microbiome in combination. So I would encourage anyone at any age to take a look at it. And really, it's a matter that our own bodies at the moment are the best test, because of the fact that we still have a lot to learn about the microbiome.
Yeah. Fantastic, Rodney. So I love talking with you. There's a few final questions that we have, but again, the book is called The Human Superorganism, so folks should really check this out. We'll put the link in the show notes at highintensityhealth.com/146. So kind of 4 final questions. You end the book on some of the fermented foods that we've talked about, but also a little segment on GMO foods, which is really polarizing. It's a hot topic right now. People are on, one side of the fence. The pro side is like, hey, we need to feed the world. In order to do that, we need to genetically modify the foods. And other people are saying, hey, what are you doing with the environment? Glyphosate's affecting the microbiome of the soil as our own microbiome. So give us an overview of GMO foods. What should we know about? What should we be concerned about?
So I think you stated it exactly correctly in terms of where I am, Mike. And that is that GMO foods, in the best scenario, have not necessarily been shown to be safe for the microbiome. And in fact, with the soil microbes, there is evidence in the literature that they present a hazard. So then the question is, if they're a hazard there, are they a hazard for similar microbes in our own body? And I think that is still a real possibility. So, I mean, my own personal preference is, if in doubt, I'm probably going to try to steer clear as much as possible. That is not to say they are a known hazard. That is to say that, at least based on the soil microbe experience, that they have been shown to have toxicity for some microbes, and they've not been vetted, as far as I'm concerned, in the case of the human microbiome. So I think that, again, if you wanted to err on the side of safety, you'd make one decision. On the other hand, that may be difficult in terms of food choices. It's a personal decision. But I think that there's more safety that needs to be done before we would say that they're known to be safe for the human microbiome.
Yeah, especially because they persist in the environment. We're finding, I think I read a paper in Mississippi where rainwater has glyphosate, so it's
Exactly.
recirculating. So it's pretty scary
Exactly.
stuff.
I mean, and we've seen similar things. I mean, I go into BPA in the book, and I've given lectures on BPA, and again, different countries have made different decisions about that. But I think as has gone on, those that were concerned about it early on, that's being validated. And the question is, you don't want to find out 2 generations later that we should have been worrying about GMOs because they weren't shown to be safe for the microbiome.
Beautiful. I commend you for doing that work, because I know you can make a lot of enemies very quickly, kind of promoting, the truth and the science, right? Industry wants to really suppress that information. So thanks for doing that, Rodney. So,
well, thank you, Mike. And what I'm trying to do is just present the biology and kind of let the chips fall as they may in the end.
So we have 3 final questions that we ask every guest on the show. These are a little bit more personal, kind of a rapid fire type format. If there was one herb, nutrient, or botanical that you just could not live without, maybe it's a supplement, maybe it's a special vitamin or a food substance, what would that be and why?
Okay. And that's actually a very difficult question, because my wife and I take several different supplements. One of my go-tos is a mineral, magnesium. At my age, one of my hobbies is swing dancing, and I do a lot of it, as much as I can. And it's actually prevents cramps. my metabolism's better. It's so actually magnesium is one of my go-tos, but it has to do in part with my hobby and my activities and trying to be physically active as well. Astragalus would be the herb very
Mm,
likely, and ginkgo a close second.
hmm.
Um, so those would be my choices, but it's hard to pick.
Oh, right. So ginkgo and astragalus, do those affect the microbiome that you know of?
I think there's some evidence on
Yeah.
astragalus, not again, not as extensive as you'd like to see
Yeah.
in the literature. So there's more on environmental chemicals and more on drugs, a little bit less on herbs at the moment.
So we're seeing some of the phenolics, like from blueberry compounds, resveratrol.
Yes. Oh, there it is. Because the
Yeah.
metabolism, it's better. Some of those compounds are very well studied,
Hmm.
and as a result, it's easy to go right into the genes and the metabolism that is within the bacterial species. And so you're exactly right. In
Interesting.
those cases, it's easier to understand grape metabolism, for example, through the microbiome than for some other herbs.
Right, right. Fascinating. So we want to know your morning routine, Rodney. You wrote this amazing book. You're doing a lot of research. You're working at Cornell. What does the first couple hours of your day look like? Do you have any special routines that involve microbiome restoration or health or mindset? Anything you want to share?
Yeah, I wish. Well, I should tell you that the whole way I got into um, this area of
Hmm.
science, I always worked on the immune system. I always worked on protecting early life, protecting babies, and in risk for the immune system in early life. But I didn't always work on the microbiome. That came about through trying to write a paper, getting very frustrated, putting it aside, and then waking up in the middle of the night from a dream with this idea about the completed self.
Hmm.
And then trusting the gut instincts that that's the direction I needed to follow. So
Mm.
my early mornings are often spent waking up with an inspiration or with an idea and working then. So I do my best work in the early morning, and it's I do drink coffee in the mornings, but I nudge that in as I'm writing or as I'm working. So I kind of start in this between sleep state and start working, and then gradually wake up a little bit more.
Hmm.
And that's actually when I do my best work.
That's
And
fantastic.
so it's not necessarily a question of supporting the microbiome at that point, but it's more when I think I have some of the ideas that have proven to be most useful for me.
Hmm. Yeah, the creativity I've noticed in the morning is much higher than throughout the day. Our
Yeah.
willpower to sit and,
Well,
yeah,
and if you don't mind me mentioning it,
go for it.
one of the courses I teach at Cornell, I teach a creative tools for scientists at Cornell, actually, that includes sleep-based problem solving and ways to utilize that as a strategy. And so, yeah, it is it's a personal experience for me, but it is for others as well. If you look at a lot of Nobel laureates, you'll find that they keep a notepad or something, or iPad near their bed, and they're typing in the ideas they get in the middle of the night.
Hmm. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, that story I think you mentioned, it was in 2012. You were writing a paper for Future magazine, it was.
Well, I
And
was writing a paper actually for a physics journal
okay.
called Entropy, and it was a really neat question. The question was if you could measure one single thing that would tell you the life course of a baby in terms of health versus disease,
Hmm.
the best predictor of a healthful life from one filled with disease for a baby, what would it be? And I was sure, I'd worked on this topic for 35 years at that point or whatever. I was pretty sure I knew the answer. And I couldn't write it at all. It was terrible. I was just roadblocked. And that's when I kind of gave up, went to bed, and woke up with this idea of, well, the completed self, the baby has to self complete with the microbiome.
Mm.
And until that's what you should measure. You should measure the extent to which a baby becomes complete in infancy as the predictor for future health versus future disease. And of course, I had the idea. I had to actually do the research, the literature, to write the paper. And my wife, I should say, helped translate that because sometimes the middle of the night ideas are not that
Right.
linear. And and so that concept actually was seen by some UK film producers. They made a movie called Microbirth that featured that as one of the themes, and that is really how I got into the microbiome. And it's
Mm.
kind of built upon that, with more building blocks being added to that. But yeah, it was actually having a roadblock and not relying on my 35 years of research experience, but relying on an idea I got gut instinct, so to speak. Middle
So
of the night.
powerful.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that story in such detail. I love that, Rodney. So, final question. If you were to bump shoulders with someone from the World Health Organization, maybe a president of the United States or another country in an elevator, what would you share with them in 30 seconds? Some sort of health or lifestyle tip or something they should know about in terms of disease prevention? How would you articulate that to them?
Yeah. That non-communicable diseases are the worldwide killer, US, but also globally. We can't afford it. I think the estimates from the World Economic Forum, Harvard School of Public Health are it's going to occupy about 50% of global net worth by 2030. It's causing us to be more isolated. You can't even have birthday parties with for your children anymore without knowing food sensitivities, intolerances, allergies of guests. It's very hard to prepare anything to get together. Flying on an airplane is at risk because you may encounter sensitivities, allergies, and health problems that we just didn't see 2 generations ago. So those are the killers. Those are the ones that are going to burst the healthcare system. Those are the ones that are causing us to run out of caregivers. But there are solutions, but they're only there if we treat the whole human, if we approach the health of the whole human, which includes the microbiome. And that means precision medicine and these wonderful initiatives that many governments have started, including the US. They can deliver, but they're only going to deliver if they're considering diet, microbiome restoration, and that as part of the health strategy, both in prevention and in future medical treatment. So it can't be piecemeal. It can't be mammalian only.
Beautifully said, Rodney. So you have the book coming out in July. If folks want to reach out to you, connect with you online, is there a website or should they go to Cornell? How can folks?
Yeah, they can come to Cornell. Email is my 3 initials, RRD, the number 1, @ Cornell, CORNELL.edu. And I'll try to respond to as many as is possible. And Mike, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these ideas and to be on your show.
My pleasure. This was a lot of fun. Congrats on the great work and the awesome book. Keep it up, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.